Well, welcome back, everyone, to Bayou Sports Talk on Oldie 640 KTIB. Your host, William Taylor, here, and on the line with us today as we continue our Saints of the 1960 series, the gentleman who was part of the organization in 68 and 69, and a lot of good stories, and, you know, pretty quality guy as well. And, of course, that's Mike Rengel. How you doing today, Mike?
Doing great, William. How are you?
All righty. How's everything up in beautiful Colorado?
It's a great sunny day here in Colorado, but I am kind of talking to you brings back memories of those great spring days in Louisiana as well.
And of course, you're kind of used to cool climates because you were born in the Minnesota area, right?
Yeah, I grew up in Minnesota, and for some of the younger listeners out there, I was born and raised before the Vikings were around, and as we were talking about earlier, I was a Green Bay fan back in those days.
Ah, very good. Now now of course later on you would attend college at Air Force Academy.
Yes.
And now even though you would later transfer to Hawaii, were you required to serve any military time?
I did. I was in the Air Force Reserves during my 10-year with the Saints, and was discharged actually during my last year with the Saints in 1970.
Now, what was the reason why you transferred over to the University of Hawaii?
Well, after growing up in Minnesota, in the cold tundra, so to speak, and growing up in a very disciplined German home, going to a private Catholic all-boys school, then going to a all-boys military college. You answer the question, where would you rather, if you had an opportunity to go to sunny Hawaii with scantily dressed Hawaiian girls, which would you rather do?
Well, I think I'll take Hawaii over that.
There you go. There you go. So Hawaii was a great place to grow up. I say I grew up in Hawaii because it was the first time I ever had to make decisions on my own, and the football was great. And after having played against Notre Dame and University of Colorado and other major Nebraska and other major colleges that the Air Force Academy plays against, University of Hawaii in those days was an NAIA school, and they were just starting to upgrade their football program, so they were looking to do that, which is one of the reasons why they contacted me.
Mm-hmm.
And so after playing against Nebraska, I opened my first game at Air Force Academy against Nebraska. My first game in Hawaii was against Linfield College.
Wow.
So football in Hawaii was a whole lot more fun, and at Air Force, I never was able to make a tackle on the line of scrimmage on the opposite side of the field because the players were just too much faster. But in the NAIA and Division II schools that we played at Hawaii, I was suddenly making tackles from sideline to sideline. So it was a lot of fun. Gave me valuable experience and the confidence to be able to believe that I could play at the level when I got a call from the Saints who asked me to come to New Orleans and try out as a free agent in 1968.
And, of course, I was going to get into that now. You get the call from the Saints in 68. Now, it also says here, and kind of give me the time on this. You signed with the Saints in 68, but it also says that you played minor league football in 68 in Orange County, California.
Yeah, Tom Fears was the coach in New Orleans at that point in time, and he came from the Lombardi era, and he believed that the rookies make mistakes, and so he had a very heavily veteran team. And also what contributed to my going to play minor league football was the fact that when I joined the Saints, I was switched from a defensive lineman to offensive line my first year. And so the Saints had had an affiliation with the Continental League football team in Southern California, the Orange County Ramblers. And so for a portion of that season, I went to Orange County to get valuable playing time as an offensive lineman. That team ultimately went, and I played in the Continental League Football League Championship game in Orlando, and was voted first team all Continental League as a offensive left tackle in those days. What's interesting about that is the next year with the Saints in '69, I went through the spring practices and that was thinking that I would be able to vie for a starting position with the Saints. When the 2 days before training camp started, I read in the paper, I'd already gone to California for training camp, and I read in the paper that the Saints had traded for 2 veteran offensive tackles. Mm-hmm. And I said, oh my gosh, here I thought I was going to be, have a chance to start, and here they bring in two new veterans. So I get to training camp, sit down for the first meeting, and I had my white offensive jersey on for the first opening meeting, and Tom Fears came up to me and sat down, and he said, Mike, you know, we went and traded for these 2 guys. We want you to go back and play on the defensive side this year, which I ultimately did, and made the opening season roster there in '69.
I was going to say, if my memory's right, one of those tackles they got, I believe, was Errol Linden.
Errol Linden, and the other one was Don Talbert.
Don Talbert, okay,
Yep.
I do remember that name.
Yep.
Now, of course, 1969, so they move you back to the defensive line, and according to the old media guide here, I had to dig out that you were only active for 5 games that year?
Yeah, I got hurt during that season. Hurt my knee. I don't remember what game it was, but sat out the rest of that season. And then in 1970 season, the defensive lineman had a change of coaches. Fears had gone by, and J.D. Roberts was the coach, and Doug Atkins retired. Really thought I had my shot in 1970. I was in great shape, had worked hard for that season, and had come in and got hurt during the training camp, ruptured a disc in my back, and that was the end of it.
Wow. Now, going back to '69, because I know you got a lot of good memories about a lot of good guys that played on that team. That was a team that went 5-9 after starting the season, I think, 0-6. The first win that year, November 2nd, I'm sure you remember, at St. Louis against the Cardinals. I believe the score was 51-42. Billy Kilmer and the Cardinals' Charlie Johnson each had 6 touchdown passes. Still to this day an NFL record.
Yeah, I think Bramowitz had quite a day that day as well.
Himself and Al Dodd also played at receiver in that game.
You bet.
And that was also the first game Dave Parks got converted to tight end.
Yeah, that's right. And that is what turned that season around. Parks had been a great wide receiver when we got him. But he had lost a step, which is the reason why I think that he came over to the Saints as compensation in that trade. Mm-hmm. But when they moved him to tight end, he had enough speed where he could beat those linebackers, and so they had to put the safety on him. So they stopped double teaming on the outside, and that really got that offensive passing game going, which opened up the running game for Andy Livingston and others
here, Andy Livingston and Tony Baker.
There you go. That was the name I was trying to remember.
The two of them combined, 1,500 yards rushing.
Yeah.
And, of course, you had other good guys in the backfield like Tom Barrington. And I'm going to forget some other names as well. Ernie Wheelwright.
There you go.
And,
Wheel.
And so some decent running backs back. After the season, in fact, Coach Fears and his staff was named to the Run the East squad of the Pro Bowl. And you had Andy Livingston, Tony Baker, Jake Cupp, and Tom Dempsey all went to the Pro Bowl as well. So it's obviously a darn good team that had some decent players there.
Yeah, it was a veteran-led team. Tony Baker was a second-year player, I believe, in '69. I think he was a rookie with me in '68, if my KTIB Memories serves me correct. And we had a very solid defensive line too. Tillman and Rowe were outstanding defensive players, as you know, and we had Doug Atkins, the Hall of Famer, and Dave Rowe has at least one Super Bowl ring for his tenure with the Oakland Raiders.
That's right. And a lot of young people think he's only just an announcer on SEC games.
There you go.
Now, Doug Atkins, we have to talk about him, because here's a gentleman, when you were with the Saints in '69, it would be his 17th and last year in the NFL at age 39, and I'll bet you watching him play and being alongside of him, he probably was just as good as when he was 23.
Well, he certainly was. Doug played at a unusually high level for a defense. I mean, even at the end of his career. And I believe, I'm not a statistician or a real historian like you are, but I don't know of a defensive lineman other than Jim Marshall that played longer than Doug Atkins did, because defensive linemen take a lot of abuse. I mean, I only lasted two seasons and a couple of weeks in training camp, and before my body gave out. But Doug played at a high level to the end. And I'd like to, I've shared this with you before, to tell this little story about Doug's last game. And before I do that, for some of the younger listeners out there, Doug Atkins was a perennial Pro Bowl player. He's in the Hall of Fame, and made the John Madden All-Century team. He was about 6'8", about 285 pounds, and had been the SEC high jump champion when he was in University of Tennessee. Played basketball in addition to football. I mean, a great athlete that was incredibly strong and just a man of man. But anyways, in his last game, we were playing against Pittsburgh at home, and we were ahead of them in the last couple of minutes, and I think the score was 27-24. And we had always been competitive in our games, but our biggest problem was that we would lose games in the end after leading much of the game. And Pittsburgh was driving for either a tying field goal or a winning touchdown. And they were it was 3rd and 7 around the 35-yard line, and it would have been a long field goal attempt. But Pittsburgh decided to go back and go to a pass. And I think Dick Shiner was the quarterback then. But as he dropped back to pass, the next thing you see is Big Doug sacking Shiner for about a 7 or 8 yard loss. Took him out of field goal range. They punted to the Saints, and we ran out the clock. And so on Doug's last play, he got a sack, and in my opinion, won the game.
Very much so, and it was someone, ironically, the great voice of NFL films, John Facenda, said that Hollywood could never have written a better script than to end Doug Atkins' career on that kind of play.
But there's something that that he doesn't know that I'd like to share with your audience there, if time's permitting.
Sure, go ahead.
And that was the next day. There were, it was the last game of the season, just a couple of days before Christmas, and we weren't required to watch the films.
Mm.
So there was a very small group of us that were watching the films with Jack Faulkner, who was the defensive coach back then. But in respect for Doug, all of the defensive linemen were there, and I think Dave Witzel and a couple of the other veterans that had known Doug personally over the years were there to watch those films. And we got down to the last play, and Faulkner didn't say a word, and he just brought the film back and forth, so that we could observe this play. And as a major, significant move for a defensive lineman back in those days, it's illegal today, was to do a head slap, where you basically took your hand and you slapped the offensive player in the side of the helmet. And with somebody that was strong as Doug, that was a real threat. So as we watched this film back and forth in slow motion, you could kind of see what was going through the offensive tackle's mind. He had in his mind that Doug was going to give him a head slap. So after he got into his pass blocking position, he dropped his body down about a foot, so that if Doug did a head slap, that he would miss. And so, but what Doug didn't head slap him, he put one hand on his shoulder and hurdled him, and then tackled the quarterback.
Wow.
And so I said to Doug, Doug, you can't retire. Look at that play. I don't care if you're 39 years old. You just hurdled that guy, and you sacked the quarterback. And he said, Mike, no. He said, really, that's a perfect example of why I have to retire. And I said, Doug, what do you mean? I said, I'm 23 years old. If I tried to hurdle that guy, I'd get impaled on his face mask, and I wouldn't be able to procreate for the rest of my life. And he said, no, Mike, he said, that's a perfect example, because when I was at your age, I wouldn't have had to put my hand on his shoulder.
Wow. Pretty incredible.
Yep, he was an incredible man, and I had the pleasure of being a representative for the Saints along with Eddie, who was then the president of the Saints,
Eddie Jones.
To be the two Saints representatives at the Hall of Fame when Doug got inducted into the Hall of Fame, and it was a real honor for me to share that special weekend with him up there in Canton.
You know, an unofficial record you were probably kind of aware of, but a great story for you. Prior to 1973, the New Orleans Saints never kept official track of quarterback sacks. And so I decided a few years ago that I would try to find them between 67 and 72. The amazing thing about Doug Atkins, now all my numbers are unofficial, but I think they're valid. In the first 6 years, and I'll have to check, it still may be a 3-year record for any player. In 67, 68, 69, he had 29 quarterback sacks.
I can believe it. And this was, as I said, it's a testimony to the high level of play that he had to the very end. And the stories that I've heard about Doug from older players, was that you never would one-on-one block, because there was no man that could block him by himself. That he was always double-teamed, and despite that, he still made the Pro Bowl every year.
Wow. Now, you mentioned Doug and just the incredible ride he had, because, in fact, in 1995, the Saints Hall of Fame of Kenner inducted him as well. And, just an incredible football player. And I guess also the years on the line, you were there. You mentioned, of course, Dave Rowe and Mike Tilleman. And I believe Dan Colchico was also part of that crew as well.
Yeah, he was. He was there in '69, and Dan was on the reserve squad when we started the season, and then when I got hurt, he stepped in to fill my spot.
Also in '69, you mentioned his name earlier. He probably helped out that team as well. You had a pretty well-established veteran as well in Dave Witzel.
Yeah, Dave was the great thief, I think, is what we used to call him. He wasn't the fastest cornerback in the league, and so people used to throw at him a lot thinking that they could beat him. But I think at one point, you know, he was amongst the career interception leaders for active players while we were playing. Great quarterback and an excellent human being.
Because he, the 3 years he was with the Saints, 67 to 69, 19 interceptions.
There you go.
And his first year in New Orleans, he had 10 and was named UPI Comeback Player of the Year and the first ever Saint to go to the Pro Bowl.
Is that right? I didn't know that.
Oh, he did quite a lot of stuff for this organization. And, you know, when you were there, like I said, 69 and 70, and you mentioned those names. There's one guy I want you to talk about, and I didn't mention this earlier because I forgot his name. You also had a pretty good defensive line coach in Ed Kayat.
Yeah, Eddie was quite the guy. He was one of the sources for many of the stories that I heard about Doug in the early years. And I'll see if I can tell you for your audience a story of what Eddie Kayat did in 1968 when we broke training camp in San Diego. He took all of the rookies that were going to make the team and make the trip to New Orleans, and he took us aside and he said, guys, he said, you're going to be going to New Orleans. And he said, there are going to be lots of people there in New Orleans that are really going to think that you're special. Because, you know, the fans in Louisiana are amongst the best in the world, and they really love their Saints. And along with the regular fans, there are going to be some female admirers that are going to come around, and they're going to want to be near you. And he said, I'm not going to tell you what to do or what not to do. He said, but I want you to realize this. You didn't suddenly get pretty or handsome or debonair, because when your career with the Saints are over, most of these girls will move on to another player.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
That was and it was good advice, because there were a lot of temptations, things that were offered for players, so that was very good advice, and I appreciate Eddie for his counsel.
And of course, Ed Kayat, to this day, as we speak, is heavily involved in arena football and has been a head coach with different teams in the league. Ironically, in '91-92, he was the head coach at the New Orleans Knight.
Is that right? I did not know that.
And he's now back in, I think he's from, he was living in Pennsylvania for a good while. And but he's still very much active in arena football in general. So he's definitely had a nice long career, to say the least.
Yeah, he's a good man and a good Southerner as well. I think he's from the Pascagoula area, right?
That's correct. The town is called Moss Point.
Yeah, there you go.
Moss Point, Mississippi. Now, you know, that part of those years you were there, there was a pretty good guy on offense a lot of people got to admire, who San Francisco cast off in the expansion draft in '67 when he got into a car accident, and he was almost a perfect leader for that early offense. And, of course, we're referring to Billy Kilmer.
Oh, you bet. Furnace Face was our nickname for him, because he was such a fierce competitor that his face would go bright red during the game. And again, Billy was at the end of his career when he came to New Orleans, and I did not know of him when he was a single-wing quarterback at UCLA, when he was reported to be just an incredible athlete. But he had, while he was in San Francisco as an understudy to John Brody, the Hall of Famer, he got in a horrific car accident, and many people thought he couldn't walk again. But Billy's determination and grit prevailed, and not only did he walk again, but he ultimately quarterbacked in the NFL again in New Orleans and then in Washington, where he led the Redskins under George Allen back to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, a gentleman who, especially in the early days before you came to the Saints, I think him and poor Gary Quazzo got sacked some 50 times that first year. So you knew he had to be a very tough, durable quarterback.
You bet. And after his injuries, he couldn't throw the ball all that. He didn't have a strong arm. He could barely throw a spiral. And but he had that determination, and I think most of the time he just willed that ball into the hands of those receivers.
And speaking of will, and a guy who never said quit, another guy that was pretty determined to make that team in '67 and played when you were there and played with the Saints till '73. How about Danny Abramowitz?
Well, there you go. He was a legend in New Orleans, and but it was the year before I got there, but the story prevailed that he was actually cut by the Saints in 1967, told to turn in his playbook and to go home. And he refused to do it. And that determination got him another look and got him into being able to play in the preseason games on special teams, where he excelled to the point to where the team, he made the opening day roster as a special team player. And then when he got his first opportunity to play in a game, didn't he have double-figure receptions in the first game that he played in the NFL? You probably know that.
Yeah, I believe it was 12.
Yeah, there you go.
Now, I want to lead into something else we mentioned that we have to talk about. There's a guy who joined the Saints. For people who don't know the story, he was cut by the San Diego Chargers in '69 training camp because he didn't want to wear a specific kicking shoe they wanted him to wear. This gentleman got in his car, drove 3 miles north, because back then Saints camp and Chargers camp were both on the West Coast, and this guy asked for a tryout to kick. And this gentleman, the Saints put him out to a practice field that overlooked the cliff at Cal Western University, and the first 3 footballs he kicked them so far they went over the cliff into the ocean. And of course, I'm referring to this fella who would later set an NFL record, Tom Dempsey.
You bet. Tom and I were together in '69, and I used to love him because I spent a lot of time on the kickoff team.
Mm-hmm.
And with Demps, he kicked the ball so far and so high, 90% of the time they never ran it back. So I was always appreciative of those times, because my job was to be the wedge breaker.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever run full speed into 4 guys running full speed right after, you'll know why I appreciated those balls being kicked in and out of the end zone.
A prelude to what would happen in 1970 with him. In 1969, the Saints played a game at the New York Giants where on special teams, I think it was, Steve Priest blocked the punt, ran it back for a touchdown. And then throughout the game, Tom Dempsey wound up kicking 5 field goals to beat the Giants in that game. And it must have been pretty great. You just mentioned not just on kickoffs, but to have a kicker who not only had, a decent field goal average, but also had tremendous range.
Yeah, he did, and obviously having set the record later on in in '70, he was really the first really long-range kicker, and now kickers, Elam here in Denver tied his record at altitude, and people are kicking field goals in the high 50-yard lines and even some 60s these days, but they're all soccer kickers, and they have a distinct advantage, and Dempsey was a straight-on kicker, and which most kickers were back in those days, and so he really was a new dimension in the league that the Saints had, and that was a good long-range threat.
Now, I think think we need to lead into that because here comes November 8, 1970. 5 days earlier, Coach Fears was fired as head coach, and J.D. Roberts was hired the next day. And Tom Dempsey had said that he felt going into that game maybe the team was a little bit divided over the hiring and the firing, and that here's this day against the Detroit Lions on November 8, 1970. First half into the third quarter, pretty competitive back and forth game, and a game that the Detroit Lions took the lead 16-14 on an Errol Mann 18-yard field goal with 11 seconds left. And of course that day, I believe you had mentioned to me that because you were on injured reserve, you were actually way up in the press box being a spotter for Don Criqui, right?
That's exactly right. I had been operated on for my back when Tom Fears was let go, and then when I got out of the hospital and got back to the team, I was asked to be a spotter for NBC when they were doing the games there in New Orleans. And so on this particular game, I was working with Don Criqui as his spotter, and the spotter is there to help point out who makes the tackle, who makes the sack, who rushes the quarterback. Most of that information for you listeners comes from the spotter, who is kind of the extra set of eyes and ears for the announcer. And on that play, I remember everything that happened right after that go-ahead score that you mentioned, and as I said earlier, that was typical of the way the Saints had played. We were very competitive most every game, but we often failed at the end. But in this game, it was different again, just like in Doug's last game, because Eldad took the kickoff and ran it upfield enough and got a couple of yards and then ran out of bounds. And then the Lions, playing in a prevent defense, allowed about a 15-yard out to Dodd on the sidelines, and the clock stopped again with just a couple of seconds to go. And I'm sure the Lions were surprised when the Saints lined up for a field goal, and because the pictures will show that they didn't even rush the quarterback, or rush the kick. And so Jockey Burkett was a snapper back in those days, and Joe Scarpati was the holder. And Dempsey lined up for this 63-yard field goal. And when he kicked the ball got about halfway to the goalpost, and I couldn't help my enthusiasm, and I yelled, "It was good." And I knew it was good because I'd seen Dempsey kick so often that the ball was just rolling over very, very slowly. And whenever that happened, Dempsey hit it square. If you hit it off center and you're a straight on kicker, the ball will spin real fast. But this ball was just barely turning over, and it was a calm day, and I just knew he hit it right where he wanted to hit it. And then I've got an engineering degree, and I judged the arc of the kick, and I saw the apex, or the height of the kick, and its relationship from where he kicked it from to the goalpost. And I projected in my mind that ball was going to go through the uprights. And so enthusiastically, I yelled, "It's good." And sure enough, the kick was good, and Criqui goes on to, and the color guy go on and talk about the kick and this, that, and the other, and the history of it, and so forth. And after all of the commotion died down a little bit, Criqui, it may have been the only time my name was called on national TV, because I didn't have the most illustrious football career as we went back earlier. But anyways, on national TV, Don Criqui says that I called this kick before it went over the lived in New Orleans, on the anniversary, I think it was the 8th of November, if I recall, that they would always show the Dempsey's kick. And I don't know if they do that anymore. And occasionally on the radio, they would play this longer version of the kick, and I could hear periodically my name being called out again by Don Creek.
Wow. So, and of course, where the press box was, and it was pretty high up in Tulane Stadium, you literally had that bird's eye view.
You bet. I was literally almost eye level with that kick as sailing through the air.
Well, I tell you what, it's still to this day the most memorable single moment in Saints history, and it's Tom Dempsey still talks about it on occasion, and he's always said that while and it's a great philosophy he has had all his life. He said that while he continues to pursue every day, and not based on what he did in the past. He says some days when he's feeling bad, he'll sit down at home, he'll look at the trophy the Saints gave him at the end of the season, and he says, you know, one day I wasn't too bad.
Yeah, there you go. He was more than not bad. He was a record holder and a great kicker and a great human being.
Well, I tell you what, before we close out the show today, because you've just given us so much material and so many great stories, it's one thing I want to go back to. You mentioned your engineering degree. It's also a good lesson for all the kids listening right now that maybe a career in college and pro sports is okay, but good college education can carry you much further.
There you go. That's for sure. I know I had aspirations of playing pro football, and I knew my son, who just finished his senior year in high school, when he started playing football, I know that he wanted to play professionally as well. I mean, every young kid who's a real competitor, wants to aspire to be and play with the best. But I don't know the percentages, William, but it is a very, very small percentage of the high school football players make it on to college. And then an even smaller percentage of the players that excel in college get the opportunity that I was so blessed with to play against people that were my heroes, like Jimmy Taylor and Doug Atkins and Mike Ditka and people like that that I'd idled as a kid. But I was always reminded by my father that education will be what carries you to the end. And even though I got the chance to play with these players, my career is the typical career for a person who makes it in the NFL. When I played, the average tenure of an NFL player was 3 years. So, especially back in those days, 3 years you don't earn enough money to raise your family on. And so I know that there are lots of my former players and teammates that have struggled in life because they did not get their degree. I'm very fortunate for the advice that my dad gave me, that I got my degree. I got my degree while I was playing with the Saints, and I've used it and I'm still practicing my profession today.
Well, very good. Well, listen, all the listeners down here, greatly appreciate the time you've given us as part of this series, and it's good to know out there that, whether, a player has a short career or a long career, that as long as you continue in life to be very progressive and continue to strive forward for better things every day, that, it's basically an important goal just to keep progressing.
That's right. The great legendary coach at UCLA, John Wooden, basketball coach at UCLA today, says that success is built by trying to make each day your masterpiece. Make each day the very best that you can make it, and everything else will take care of itself. And William, thank you for having me on the show, but more importantly, thank you for keeping the lives and of the players in the 60s alive for your listening audience.